You're listening to the Monday Night Community Show with Daniel on BRFM.
This is the Daniel Monday Night Community Show on demand through YouTube. Thank you very much for choosing to listen to us through this method. If you'd like to keep up to date with when I add new interviews, then subscribe to this channel. So we're going to be talking on the telephone to Ken. Firstly, thank you very much for joining us. I was hoping you could firstly introduce yourself to our listeners and just give them a sort of a brief introduction about who you are.
Oh, okay, yes. Well, my name's Ken Worpole. I'm a writer, and I've worked for many years in the field of sort of social policy around urban issues and the environment. And I suppose in the last decade or so, I've become very interested in the much maligned landscape of Essex, which bears a lot of relation actually to the landscape of North Kent. Like many people who live in London, my family came from East London, and after the war we moved out firstly to Canvey Island and then to Hadley in Essex, and then eventually to Southend, opposite Sheerness. And that's where I grew up and went to school. And then after training to be a teacher, I returned to London, where I've lived ever since. But I got quite fed up quite a few years ago with everybody talking down Essex as though it was a rather miserable, bleak place. And since my wife also comes from Essex and she's a photographer, we spent many hours, days, weeks travelling around Essex, looking at the wonderful estuaries and the marshlands and looking at the seabirds and the wildfowl. And so I've been writing a lot about that in the last few years, yeah.
So what is it that you've found, I suppose, that you didn't know or demonstrated Essex in a way that you see it?
Well, of course, the main thing is you've got to get out of the car. And I'm a keen cyclist, but I'm also a keen walker. But anybody who thinks they know Essex simply by driving up and down the A13 or the A127 or the A12 has to have another thing coming, because all the beautiful bits of the landscape really are only accessible preferably by walking along the sea wall. I'm very keen on always being close to water. So there are 5 rivers that kind of interpenetrate in Essex, starting from the Thames at the bottom up to the Stour at the top. And it's the estuary landscapes I really love, and the marshlands and the saltings, and to these you can only really get close to on foot. So
you've written a book about it. Tell us more about that and what's included in it.
Well, the first book I did literally about the landscape, I did with a photographer called Jason Alton, and Jason approached me in about 2004 because he'd taken a series of photographs of the Essex coastline. And he felt it needed a bit of sort of historical context, because a lot of the coastline, to some people, is a bit ugly. It's got a lot of ruined buildings, bits of old military infrastructure, old industrial, harbours and car works and factories and shipyards and so on. And it was helpful to the reader looking at these photographs to know what had happened, in Essex in the 20th century. So we literally did walk the 350 miles of the Essex coastline over, not all in one go, but over the course of a year. And we called the book 350 Miles. It was published in 2005, and I'm glad to say it received quite a lot of attention, and it did begin to change people's minds about how you could see Essex as being a rather mysterious and beautiful place to visit, particularly, as I say, the coastline and the estuaries.
Well, that's one of the things, I suppose, often is getting people to re-look at something they already know, and I suppose that is a a challenge sometimes.
That's right. And then 10 years, 10 years later, well, about 3 years ago, the same photographer, Jason, and I did a book called The New English Landscape, and this was more a reflection on why people, but especially, I suppose, in a way, artists and photographers, but also ecologists, were looking at, East Anglia particularly, and New as having quite rich ecological environmental history. And strangely, in places like Canvey Island, in bits left over from former oil refineries, though ecologists were finding quite large colonies of unusual small species of birds and insects and other butterflies and so on. So again, it's that change of attitude. And we also were keen to record just how many of former landfill sites have become very successful nature conservation areas. Rainer Marshes is one, Two Tree Island is another. There are quite a few former landfill sites just turned into nature conservation areas. And the Two Tree Island is, a very large colony, breeding colony of avocets.
I was going to say, I imagine that when you start looking and researching and finding places, the more you sort of find. And how did you know exactly what areas you wanted to cover? Was it a growing process, or did you have in mind particular places you wanted to visit?
Oh, it was really just simply walking the whole thing, and then becoming more sort of emotionally attached, as it were, to some places rather than others. I'm very fond of Mersey Island, but then I had childhood holidays there, and since then, we've had our own family holidays there. And as I say, I've always liked a view of the sea. So, it's amazing. You can walk around Mersey Island in a day. It's only, I think, 12 miles around the perimeter. And you can see seals at low tide, all kinds of birds. It's just tremendous. And there was also, even on the small island, the different kinds of landscapes. There is a proper fishing village, as well as kind of oyster beds and some fairly wild saltings where you can pick samphire and really feel very alone in a rather mystical landscape.
So I'm assuming that once you find somewhere like that island that you like, you start to research into the history, and that side of it goes in with the photography.
Exactly, yes. So Mersey Island is famously the site of a novel, a 19th century novel, Mahala, written by Baring Gould, the Reverend Baring Gould, who famously wrote on the Christian soldiers. I think my memory is a bit wonky sometimes, but one of the very famous Victorian hymns, and it's a great novel. But yes, and you can find writers from the 20s and 30s who've written crime novels set in these places, and of course most recently the much talked about novel of this year is a book called The Essex Serpents by Sarah Perry, and exactly explores this sort of mystical landscape of the marshlands near Malden, actually, in the estuary of the Blackwater.
So when you're researching into the history, do you find it more easier now because you've got access to the internet and people are logging stuff more, or does that not really help?
It does a bit. I do blog, by the way, so when I'm finding out something new, every 3 or 4 weeks I write up a blog. I do a lot of work in the British Library. I'm very interested in the literature of the past, and political history and the work of particular artists. There was a very good exhibition in Southend recently at the Beecroft Gallery of East London artists who'd travelled out of East London to paint different parts of the Essex landscape. There was also a big exhibition at the Focal Point Gallery in Southend, which finished about a month ago, called Radical Essex. And that was about various religious and political communities that had been set up at the beginning of the 20th century. Land colonies, labour colonies, places for retreats for people who are troubled by, poverty or alcohol problems, as well as religious doubt. And I find all these places very, very, very interesting. And of course, Essex had its own religion for much of the second half of the 19th century, the peculiar people, which by the 1950s had got 52 different chapels in the county, just the one county.
Well, it's quite interesting hearing all about Essex and the estuary, because obviously we're on the other side of that, and our studios are in Minster on the cliffs, and we actually look out across. We're very lucky, actually. We look right out across the estuary and across to Essex and Southend. So we almost have the reverse view to what you get when you're walking along the coastlines.
Well, that's right, yes. And in fact, when I was last on the Isle of Sheppey last weekend, it was fascinating to look over to Southend Pier, and I could obviously recognise and name almost, not with a pair of binoculars, every of the bigger buildings going from Shoebury Nest down to the water tower on Benfleet Hill. It is interesting because when I was always looking out from Southend down to Kent, it seemed very agricultural, apart from the big chimneys on the Isle of Grain. But in many ways, I think Sheppey has many features of Mersey Island or Canvey Island, indeed. As I say, I did spend a year and a half on Canvey just before the floods. I went to school there, and we lived in a bungalow there. So I kind of the landscape of the Isle of Sheppey, it seems to me very, very familiar.
Was there anything else you'd like to get over to our listeners that we haven't covered?
Only that I've set my mind on a cycle. I have cycled once to the Isle of Sheppey from London when the ferry line was running from Sheerness to Flushing in the Netherlands. But that was probably about 20 years ago. It was very interesting to I did it in I think it was certainly less than a day, so it was quite hard going. But I'm planning to do a cycle ride in September. Just get the train down to Gillingham and then cycle round off to Sheppey and round the island and stay overnight at Sheerness and take a couple of friends with me. Looking forward to it very much.
So when you cycle around the island, are you planning to stick to the main roads? Because, often the island is sort of very housing area one side, and then you've got all the Elmley sort of marshes and the bird reserve the other side.
Yeah, well, I'll look at the map and I'll look at the cycle routes, the blue plaque cycle routes. I try as much as possible to avoid any A or B roads and try and find the small back lanes if I can.
So it's about finding the more hidden places and the places that you don't come across in perhaps everyday life when you're even living on the island.
Exactly, yeah. I'm not keen on cycling along roads where big lorries whiz past me and sort of almost knock me off when they're, the wind effect they create. But so I'm looking forward to that. And as I say, I think there is a lot. I've just recently bought a book on the North Kent landscape. It's a collection of essays and photographs, a lot about the bird life of the North Kent marshes, and with some paintings by Billy Childish. And looking at that books reminded me how much Essex and the North Kent coast have in common.
So do you think you'd ever move on to writing about the North Kent coast as well?
I don't think so. I mean, it might be intermittently or bits and might be occasionally, but I think, in a way, people who know it, I mean, I wouldn't want to claim to know it in any way as intimately as I do know Essex. So I think it's always better if these things are written by people who know them through years of, attachment and knowledge. So, but I mean, it doesn't stop me visiting and thinking about them from time to time.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time out to talk to us here at BRFM Bridge Radio on the Monday Night Community Show.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel, for asking me.